Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, today we're going back to the 80s, to 1985 to be exact, to uncover a bit of a hidden gem, a film called The Doctor and the Devils.
Oh, interesting. I'm intrigued already.
Yeah, it's not your typical 80s horror flick.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's actually based on a real-life story that's pretty gruesome. The story of Burke and Hare.
Oh, wow, the body snatchers.
Yes, those infamous guys from 1820s Edinburgh. So we've got a blend of history and horror all wrapped up in one film.
Sounds like a fascinating mix.
Yeah, we'll see. And to dissect all of this, our main source today is going to be the film's Wikipedia entry. So let's dive in.
All right, let's do it.
I think it's amazing how this film uses a real historical event, something so dark, to explore some pretty complex themes, like ambition.
It is fascinating, yeah.
So imagine, it's 1828, you're in Edinburgh, and there's this huge demand for cadavers for medical research.
Right, a time of huge medical advancements, lots of research happening.
Exactly. But the legal supply of bodies, well, it was a bit lacking.
Not enough to meet the demand, I'd imagine.
Not at all. And that's where these grim figures come in, these resurrection men, as they were called.
Hey, resurrection men. That sounds like something straight out of a Gothic novel.
Yeah, it does have a very Gothic ring to it. Essentially, they would exhume bodies.
To sell them, right, to the anatomists who needed them.
Exactly. And a lot of it was illegal. And that's where our film, The Doctor and the Devils, comes in.
Okay, tell me more.
Two of the main characters, Fallon and Broom, are directly based on Burke and Hare.
The most notorious resurrection men in history.
Exactly. But these guys, they didn't just rob graves.
Oh, no, they went a step further.
Yeah. They resorted to murder to keep those fresh bodies coming.
That takes things to a whole other level of disturbing.
It really does. And so the film takes this real-life horror story and uses it to explore this really tough moral question. Is the pursuit of knowledge, even life-saving knowledge, worth ignoring such horrific acts?
That's the central dilemma, isn't it? Where do we draw the line?
Exactly. And the film gives us Dr. Rock, a brilliant anatomist, played by Timothy Dalton.
Timothy Dalton, wow.
He's obsessed with pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge.
Makes sense, he's an anatomist.
Right. But here's the thing. He knows where these bodies are coming from. He knows it's shady, but
he turns a blind eye.
he does. Because these bodies, these fresh cadavers, are fueling his research, leading to amazing discoveries.
It's that classic ethical dilemma, does the end justify the means?
Exactly. And it's not just Dr. Rock wrestling with this. His assistant, Dr. Murray, suspects what's happening.
Oh, so he's the moral compass of the film.
You could say that, yeah. And it puts him in a really tough spot.
He has to make a choice, doesn't he? Loyalty to his mentor
Or his own conscience. And to make things even more interesting, did you know that Mel Brooks produced this film?
Mel Brooks, as in The Blazing Saddles, Mel Brooks, the comedy legend.
One and only.
Wow, what a wild genre jump for him.
Right. Talk about a curveball. And here's another one for you. The screenplay is based on an unproduced work by Dylan Thomas.
No way. Dylan Thomas, the poet.
Yep. Suddenly we've got this whole literary dimension added to the mix.
That's amazing. So this film has more depth than meets the eye, then.
Definitely. And the story behind its production is pretty fascinating, too. You see, there was this earlier attempt to make the film, back in 1965.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Nicholas Ray was going to direct it, with Maximilian Schell in the lead role.
Interesting. So what happened? Why didn't it get made?
Well, let's just say it was a cursed production. Bad weather, payment disputes. It just fell apart.
Ah, wow, what a shame. I wonder what that version would have been like.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? But luckily, we did get a version in 1985, directed by Freddie Francis, a veteran of horror films.
Freddie Francis, okay. I know that name.
Yeah, he's a big name in the genre. And the cast is incredible. Timothy Dalton, Jonathan Pryce, Twiggy, Julian Sands, Patrick Stewart.
Wow, what a lineup. A real who's who of British talent.
Exactly. And Francis, he brought his own unique vision to the film. You see, he deliberately went for this monochrome look.
Monochrome, but they were shooting in color.
They were. But he wanted that black and white feel to create this dark, almost gothic atmosphere.
Ah, I see. That makes sense, given the subject matter.
Yeah, it really emphasizes that grim reality of 19th century Edinburgh and all the moral shadows that the characters are dealing with.
So how was the film received? Did audiences connect with that unique vision?
Well, the reviews were kind of mixed. It wasn't a box office hit. Some critics found it a bit too bleak, too focused on the dark side of things.
Yeah, I can see that. It's not exactly lighthearted material.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there were some who really appreciated it. Roger Ebert, for example. He praised Twiggy's performance. He called her a ray of sunshine in this otherwise bleak film.
High praise from Ebert. That's saying something.
Right. So here we have it. A film based on a real-life horror story, produced by a comedy legend, with a screenplay rooted in poetry, directed by a horror veteran.
What a wild combination.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it uses all of that to tackle some really big questions about ambition, morality, and scientific progress.
Sounds like a film that's worth revisiting.
Definitely. But before we go any further, let's take a closer look at the infamous figures at the heart of this story. Burke and Hare.
Yes, let's delve into the nitty-gritty of these infamous body snatchers. Who were they? What led them down this dark path?
Well, they were both Irish immigrants who came to Edinburgh looking for a better life.
The classic immigrant story, but with a very dark twist.
Exactly. They ended up running a lodging house, but then a lodger died.
And they saw an opportunity.
They did. They needed quick cash, so they sold the body to an anatomist.
Wow, and I'm guessing that hefty sum they got for it. That sort of opened their eyes to a whole new business opportunity.
You got it. It started as a crime of opportunity, not necessarily malice.
But the lure of easy money is a powerful motivator, especially when you're desperate.
Absolutely. And once they got a taste of that profit, they realized they could make a lot more if they were, well, more proactive.
Proactive meaning?
They started targeting vulnerable people on the streets.
Oh no, luring them back to the lodging house
and making sure those bodies were fresh for the anatomists.
Chilling. The things people will do for money.
It's a dark chapter in human history.
Yeah.
And their methods, as depicted in the film, were pretty brutal.
Oh, I can really imagine.
They often went after the most vulnerable, those who wouldn't be missed. And they used this method of suffocation that became known as burking.
Burking, I've heard of that.
It left no marks on the body so they could get a higher price.
It's a gruesome detail, but it really highlights their cold, calculated approach. They were like businessmen running a macabre enterprise.
Exactly. And for a while, they were successful. They provided Dr. Knox, the real-life inspiration for Dr. Rock, with a steady supply of cadavers.
Fueling his research. But it couldn't last forever, could it?
No, you're right. Secrets like that have a way of getting out. Neighbors started to notice the unusual activity at their lodging house.
The whispers, the rumors.
Exactly. Eventually, they got sloppy. One of their victims was recognized, and that's when the police got involved.
It's like they say, you can't outrun your past.
Very true. And in the end, Hare, being the opportunist that he was, testified against Burke to save his own skin.
So he got immunity.
He did. He walked free.
That's infuriating. He got away with murder.
He did. But Burke wasn't so lucky. He was hanged in January 1829 in front of a huge crowd.
Wow, public execution. That must have been a spectacle.
It was. But it's a sobering reminder that even in a society that considers itself civilized, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface.
Absolutely. The story of Burke and Hare is a dark chapter in Edinburgh's history, no doubt. But it also tells us a lot about the conditions that can lead to such horrors.
Yes, like the demand for bodies, the lack of legal options, the desperation.
It all created this perfect breeding ground for such crimes.
It makes you think about how societal problems can have these unintended consequences.
Yeah, a lot of food for thought there.
But let's bring it back to the film, to The Doctor and the Devils. You see, it doesn't just tell this gruesome story. It uses it to explore something much deeper.
Right, that moral dilemma we were talking about. How far are we willing to go for knowledge?
Exactly. And how much are we willing to overlook when it comes to how that knowledge is obtained? It's a question that's still relevant today, don't you think?
Absolutely. We face those same ethical dilemmas in so many aspects of our lives, even today. It's a question that never goes away.
So true. But let's dive a bit deeper into the real-life figure who inspired Dr. Rock, Dr. Robert Knox.
Okay, tell me about him. I'm always fascinated by the real-life inspirations behind these fictional characters.
Well, Dr. Knox, much like Dr. Rock in the film, was totally consumed by the pursuit of anatomical knowledge. Brilliant lecturer, drew huge crowds to his dissections.
A celebrity in the world of anatomy.
Exactly. And he made some real contributions to the field of medicine.
But it sounds like his ambition might have gotten the best of him.
It did. His desire to push the boundaries to make those groundbreaking discoveries. It led him down a bit of a slippery slope.
So he was the one receiving those deliveries from Burke and Hare.
He was. And while there's no proof that he knew they were murderers,
He must have suspected something was off.
right, he knew those bodies were coming from questionable sources, but he chose not to ask too many questions.
It's like he was willfully ignorant, turning a blind eye because it was convenient for his research.
Exactly. And that's what makes his story so fascinating, so complex. It raises all these questions about the responsibility of scientists.
About the ethical implications of their work, the compromises they might be willing to make.
Exactly. And unlike Dr. Rock in the film, who escapes real punishment, Dr. Knox's real life took a very different turn.
Oh, so it wasn't a Hollywood ending for the real Dr. Knox.
Not at all. The public turned on him. Even though he was never officially charged with any crime, he was ostracized by his colleagues, his reputation ruined.
A social and professional reckoning.
Exactly. His career was over.
Wow, that's a harsh reminder that even if you escape the law, you might not escape the court of public opinion.
So true. But his story also makes you wonder, how common was body snatching in 19th century Edinburgh?
Yeah, was it just a few bad apples like Burke and Hare? Or was it more widespread?
Well, the sad truth is, it was pretty prevalent. There was this huge demand for bodies, and the legal supply was so limited.
So a black market emerged.
Exactly. And some anatomists were known to pay a lot of money for fresh corpses, no questions asked.
It's hard to believe that such an ethically dubious practice was so commonplace back then.
It does seem shocking by today's standards, doesn't it?
Thankfully, medical ethics have come a long way since then. We have much stricter regulations now when it comes to obtaining cadavers for research.
That's reassuring. But knowing how common it was back then, it makes you wonder, were all the anatomists turning a blind eye? Or were there some who spoke out against it?
Good question. Were there any voices of conscience?
There were. One example is Dr. John Barclay. He was a respected anatomist, but he was very critical of Knox and his methods.
So he was advocating for ethical alternatives, even if it meant slower progress.
He was. He believed anatomists should only use legally obtained bodies.
That must have been a tough stance to take at the time, going against the grain like that.
It was. But he felt it was the only ethical way forward.
He sounds like a fascinating figure, a reminder that even in a system that's morally compromised, there are always individuals who choose to stand up for what's right.
Absolutely. But it's also a reminder that the pressure to advance knowledge can be intense, and sometimes ethical considerations get pushed aside.
Yes, progress at any cost can be a dangerous mindset.
It makes you think about the challenges facing scientists today as we push the boundaries of knowledge in fields like genetic engineering, artificial intelligence.
So many ethical dilemmas, so much potential for unintended consequences.
It's a lot to grapple with. But let's bring it back to our film, to The Doctor and the Devils. It uses this historical backdrop to really explore this question. How far are we willing to go in pursuit of knowledge?
And how much are we willing to ignore, to justify, in the name of progress?
Exactly. It's a powerful question, and one that the film doesn't offer any easy answers to. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Freddie Francis's directorial choices. What stood out to you visually?
Well, first off, that decision to shoot in color but create a monochrome palette, that was brilliant.
I thought so too. Why do you think he made that choice?
I think it was a visual metaphor for the moral ambiguity at the heart of the story, draining the world of color, leaving it stark and bleak.
Yeah, like the life is being sucked out of it, reflecting the character's moral decay.
Exactly. And the lighting, too. So masterful.
Oh, yeah. Francis knew his way around light and shadow.
He really knew how to create a sense of dread and unease. All those scenes bathed in darkness, with just a few key elements illuminated.
It makes you feel like danger is lurking just beyond the shadows.
And then those moments of stark contrast where a single ray of light pierces through the gloom. It's like he's saying, pay attention, this is important.
I know exactly what you mean. It's subtle, but so effective. It's like those moments are highlighting the film's themes, those hidden truths, those moral compromises.
It's a very clever way of guiding the viewer's eye.
Totally. Okay, so we've covered the color palette and the lighting. What else struck you?
Well, the sets and costumes were incredibly detailed, historically accurate, but also they added to the film's overall feeling of gloom.
Yeah, the costumes especially, they felt so heavy, so drab. It was like the weight of the city, the poverty was just clinging to everyone.
And those sets with the dark, narrow streets, those cramped tenements.
It creates this sense of claustrophobia, right?
Absolutely. It's a world that feels familiar in a way, but also really alien, like something out of history book, but also otherworldly.
Yeah, it perfectly captures that gothic feel of the story. The darkness, the decay. It's not just visual, it's a metaphor for the corruption at the heart of everything.
You've got it. Francis created this visually stunning world, but it's also thematically resonant.
It's a world that pulls you in, but it also makes you feel uneasy, like you wouldn't want to be stuck there.
I can imagine. But speaking of uneasiness, this is a horror film after all. Did Francis shy away from showing the gruesome details of Burke and Hare's crimes?
That's a good question. And I think he found a good balance. We do get glimpses of the aftermath of their murders, but Francis was really good at suggestion.
He knew that sometimes what we don't see can be even more terrifying than what we do see.
Exactly. He gives us just enough to make our skin crawl, and then he lets our imaginations fill in the rest.
Very effective. It leaves you with this lingering sense of dread, this feeling that the horrors we've seen are just the tip of the iceberg.
So true. But as much as I appreciate those moments of horror, I also found myself drawn to those quieter scenes, the character-driven moments.
Oh, me too. Those moments where the characters are wrestling with their consciences, they're so unsettling.
Because they force us to confront the potential for darkness that exists within all of us.
And the film does that so well. It shows us that even the most seemingly civilized individuals can be corrupted by their ambitions, their greed, their desperation.
It's a reminder that the line between good and evil is often blurred, much more than we like to think.
Exactly. But, for all its darkness, The Doctor and the Devils also manages to inject some humor into the story.
It does. And I was surprised by that, considering the subject matter. But it's so well done, so subtle.
Francis had a real knack for finding those moments of levity without undermining the film's overall tone.
Like those scenes with Fallon and Broom, they're these vile characters, but there's something almost darkly comedic about their interactions.
Yes. It's like a twisted sort of buddy comedy with death as the punchline.
It's a testament to the actors, Jonathan Pryce and Stephen Rea, that they could find that humor, that humanity, in such deeply flawed characters.
Absolutely. It speaks to the film's intelligence, its sophistication. It's not afraid to embrace the absurd, even in a story about such horrific acts.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even in the face of death, there's always room for laughter, for a recognition of the absurdity of it all.
That's a great point. And it's one of the things that makes The Doctor and the Devil such a rich and complex film. But, we can't talk about this film without talking about the setting. 19th century Edinburgh. It's not just a backdrop, it's a character in itself.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I was hoping we'd get to talk about that. I've been dying to dive into the atmosphere of the city. What was it like back then to walk those cobblestone streets?
Well, imagine a city caught between two worlds. The Industrial Revolution is starting to reshape things, but Edinburgh was still holding on to its medieval past.
So a city in transition, grappling with change.
Exactly. The streets were narrow, often lost in fog, with these towering tenements casting long shadows everywhere.
It sounds like a setting ripped straight from a Gothic novel.
It's no coincidence that so much Gothic literature came out of Edinburgh during that period. The architecture, the history, the social contrasts.
It all fed into that Gothic sensibility.
Absolutely. And those social contrasts are really on display in the film. You see the wealthy areas, those opulent lecture halls where Dr. Rock works, but then you also see the poverty, the desperation of the slums.
It was a city of extremes, progress and poverty existing side by side.
And the medical schools, with their need for bodies, they were like a bridge between those two worlds.
A Graham Bridge.
For sure. But there's another aspect of 19th century Edinburgh that I think is relevant here. The city's relationship with death.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, back then, death was much more present in everyday life. People died at home, surrounded by their families.
It wasn't hidden away like it often is today.
Exactly. And in Edinburgh, with its limited space for burial, graveyards were overcrowded. Bodies were sometimes buried in shallow graves.
I can see how that would create this constant sense of unease, this feeling that the dead were never really gone.
Yes, and it made body snatching much easier, of course.
Right. The graves are easy targets.
But there's another layer to this relationship with death, something that people were truly terrified of back then. Premature burial.
Oh my gosh, being buried alive. That's a nightmare.
It was a very real fear in the 19th century. Medical diagnoses weren't as advanced as they are today, and there were actual cases of people being mistakenly declared dead and buried alive.
That's horrifying. I can't even imagine.
People were so afraid of this that they designed all sorts of safety coffins.
Safety coffins.
Yeah, with bells or flags, even escape hatches so someone buried alive could signal for help.
Wow. It's incredible how much that fear gripped people's imaginations.
It did. But how do you think this fear ties into our film and to Dr. Rock's actions?
That's interesting. Well, he was getting these bodies that were fresh, hadn't been buried for very long.
So in a way, those fresh bodies might have been reassuring to him. Proof that they were truly dead, not just in a coma or something.
That's a really interesting point. It's like a twisted logic. But it makes sense in that context. He could convince himself he was doing a good deed, saving people from a fate worse than death.
Exactly. It adds a layer of complexity to his character, to his motivations. It's not just about cold, heartless science. He might have genuinely believed in some twisted way that he was doing the right thing.
It's both fascinating and disturbing to consider that. And it really speaks to the film's ability to explore those moral gray areas, those moments where good intentions can lead us down some very dark paths.
Absolutely. And that's what makes The Doctor and the Devil such a compelling and thought-provoking film. It challenges us to examine our own assumptions about right and wrong, to confront the darkness that exists within ourselves and within society as a whole. You know, as we've been talking about The Doctor and the Devils, the history, the visuals, I keep thinking about how much it all still applies today.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's not just some historical piece. It feels really relevant.
Like, think about all the stuff we consume, our phones, clothes, even food. Do we always think about where it all comes from, how it was made?
It's easy to just not think about it. You know, especially if it's convenient or cheap.
But that's what the film makes you question, right? That complacency. Like, Dr. Rock, we can't always just say we didn't know. We've got all this information, documentaries, investigations exposing the dark side of things.
It's like we focus on the end result, the
Yeah.
shiny new whatever, and ignore the harm that might have happened along the way.
Yeah, willful blindness.
Yeah.
But the film forces us to see that. It asks, how much are we willing to overlook just to have things easy or comfortable or for progress?
That's a lot to think about. But even if we admit that, what can we really do as just one person? It feels so huge.
It's true that things need to change on a bigger level, but it starts with us, each of us making better choices. Being informed, supporting companies that do things right, speaking out when we see something wrong.
So being more mindful consumers and holding each other accountable.
Yeah, exactly. Like Dr. Murray in the film, sometimes we have to make tough choices, even if it's uncomfortable to challenge the way things are.
Speaking of Dr. Murray, his relationship with Dr. Rock is so interesting. It's that whole mentor-student thing, but way more complicated.
Totally. You've got Dr. Rock, the ambitious mentor who bends the rules, and then there's Dr. Murray, the student who's trying to do the right thing.
And it's like their whole relationship becomes this battle between those two sides.
And it makes you think about how responsible mentors are for their students, to guide them ethically even when it clashes with their ambition.
Because ambition without any limits is dangerous. Sometimes you need someone to show you a better way.
Right, and for them, it ends really badly. Rock's so ambitious, he won't listen to Murray. And Murray has to choose between loyalty and his conscience.
It's heartbreaking. It reminds you that what we do affects others too, not just ourselves.
Choices matter. Speaking of choices, how about those choices Francis made as the director? The way he uses the camera is incredible.
Oh, I've been wanting to talk about that. The cinematography is what makes this film stand out. It's not just your typical horror stuff.
It's all about mood atmosphere, that feeling of dread that just gets to you.
And he does it with those close-ups.
Uh-huh.
The camera's right there in their faces. You can feel how anxious they are at their struggles.
It's like he's making us confront that darkness inside all of us, like we're all capable of that.
Then you get those wide shots of Edinburgh, the buildings, the fog. It's claustrophobic.
Like the city itself is trapping them, closing in.
Francis really understood how to use visuals to tell this story. To make this world that's both beautiful and terrifying.
A world that feels both real and like a dream. It's part of what makes the film so good.
You know, it's interesting you say that about familiarity, because it's set in the past, but it taps into these very basic fears we all have.
Oh, absolutely. Like that fear of being buried alive, which was huge back then.
Exactly. The film plays on that and it gets to you. But it's more than that. It's the fear of the unknown, the dark being powerless against something bigger.
It's like it's working on our instincts. The stuff we're all afraid of deep down.
But what really gets me are the quiet moments. The scenes where they're facing their own choices.
Those are the ones that stay with you. They force you to see how much darkness we all have inside.
They show that good and evil aren't so clear-cut. and that even good people can be tempted.
It's a reminder that horror isn't always about blood and guts. Sometimes it's about what's going on in our own minds.
The real monsters are the ones we carry inside.
And speaking of monsters, Burke and Hare are obvious. But Dr. Rock is a monster too, but in a different way.
Burke and Hare are just greedy, no empathy. But Dr. Rock, he's not all bad. He just lets his ambition take over.
He's a cautionary tale, right? About how wanting something too much can make you lose your way.
And it shows that even people who seem good people in positions of power can do terrible things.
It makes you think The Doctor and the Devils isn't just about horror. It's about life. It's about how hard it is to be good when the world is so messed up.
It asks these big questions, but it doesn't give you the answers. It makes you figure it out yourself.
And that's what makes it so powerful. It stays with you. It makes you think about the world and yourself.
It makes you look beyond the surface, question everything, and remember to hold on to your humanity no matter how dark things get.
And speaking of looking beyond the surface, there's one part of The Doctor and the Devils we haven't really talked about yet. The whole science versus religion thing.
Oh yeah, that's everywhere in the film. The clash between reason and faith.
You've got Dr. Wack. He's all about science progress, figuring out the universe through logic. But the film also shows that people need faith, something more than just the physical world.
And those two ideas, they clash a lot, especially back then in Edinburgh. Religion was still a big part of life.
Right, and the film shows those clashes, Dr. Rock versus the church people freaking out over his dissections, the characters doubting.
It's like it's saying that neither science nor religion has all the answers.
Maybe it's about finding a balance between them, using both reason and faith to understand the world.
Not picking sides, but bringing them together, finding a way to make them work.
That's a good way to put it. It's relevant today, too, when science and religion are often seen as opposites.
But the film says maybe there's a way to bridge that gap, to find common ground. And that could make the world a better place. More knowledge, but also more compassion.
Beautifully said. And maybe that's the film's greatest impact. It reminds us that searching for truth, whether it's through science, religion, or just trying to be good, it takes both our minds and our hearts.
We need to be curious, but also have the courage to do what's right, to question things and embrace how complex life really is.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's talk about Burke and Hare, the real guys. They're still fascinating even today.
Oh, for sure. Their crimes are legendary. They've inspired so many books, movies, plays. Why do you think we're still so drawn to them after all this time?
It's probably a lot of things. The horror of it is just undeniable. People being murdered for profit. It's something we can all understand on a basic level.
It makes you sick to your stomach to think about it. Violating human life like that.
Exactly. But there's also the moral side of it. Dr. Knox knowing where those bodies came from and doing nothing. It makes us question progress. How far is too far?
It shows how good intentions can go bad. How ambition can turn into something terrible.
And let's not forget the social aspect. Burke and Hare targeted the weakest people in society, the ones no one would miss, the ones in power didn't care about.
It shows how poverty and desperation make people vulnerable, and how those in power can just ignore the suffering of others.
That's why their story still resonates today. It's about the dark side of us, all about the danger of wanting too much, and about the systems that allow terrible things to happen.
It reminds us that we're all capable of both good and evil, and that what we choose to do matters as individuals and as a society.
The Doctor and the Devils captures all of that. It doesn't shy away from the darkness, but it also shows hope, redemption, and the strength of the human spirit.
It stays with you. It makes you think and feel. And it shows how powerful movies can be to explore the dark side of who we are.
But even with all the darkness and moral stuff, The Doctor and the Devils also has moments of humor, which is surprising.
I know, right? You wouldn't expect it given what it's about. But it's there, and it works well.
It's subtle and dark, but it's there for a reason. What do you think it adds to the film?
Well, for one thing, it breaks up the tension a bit. It's so grim that you need those moments of release.
Like, even in the worst times, we can still laugh. We can see the absurdity of it all.
And I think the humor also points out how hypocritical and messed up the whole situation is.
Oh, yeah. Give me an example.
Like Fallon and Broom Burke and
Right.
Hare.
Yeah.
They're awful people. But there's something funny about how they talk to each other. It's like dark humor.
Like, they don't even realize how bad what they're doing is. Like, it's a game.
Exactly. They're so focused on their own greed that they've lost their humanity.
It's like the film is saying, look at these idiots messing with death. They're so clueless.
And that cluelessness makes them even scarier. It shows how messed up their morals are.
I think you're right. The humor isn't just there for laughs. It's pointing out how absurd and wrong everything is. It's like a critique of society itself.
It uses humor to make a serious point, to expose the darkness hidden beneath the surface, to make us question what we think is right and wrong.
It's clever, and it makes The Doctor and the Devils even better. It's not just horror. It's about life and how hard it is to be good when everything's so messed up.
But let's shift gears again back to that science versus religion theme. It runs throughout the film.
Yeah, Dr. Rock is all about logic, reason, progress. He thinks science can explain everything. But the film also shows that people need faith. They need to believe in something bigger.
And those two ideas don't always get along,
Yeah.
especially back in Edinburgh when religion was such a big part of life.
Right. The film shows those clashes, Dr. Rock versus the church people getting upset about his work, people struggling with their beliefs.
It's like the film is asking, what are the limits of science and religion? Maybe neither one has all the answers.
Maybe it's about finding a balance, not choosing sides, but combining those ways of thinking.
Not one or the other, but both together. Using reason and faith to make sense of the world.
It's a really interesting idea, and it's relevant today, too, when science and religion are often seen as opposites.
But the Doctor of the Devils suggests maybe there's a way to bring those ideas together, to find common ground between them, and that could make the world a better place.
A world where knowledge and compassion go hand in hand, that's the ideal.
And that's a really hopeful message coming from such a dark film. Maybe that's what makes it so powerful. It doesn't just show us the darkness, it shows us a way out.
It reminds us that we can choose. We can choose to embrace the light even when things are difficult. And that choice, that's what really matters. It's like he's justifying his actions by telling himself that it's all for the greater good, for the advancement of science.
But deep down, I think he knows he's crossed the line. That conflict between his beliefs and his actions, that's what makes him such a tragic figure.
You're right, it adds a layer of complexity to the character. And it's one of the reasons why the film is so haunting. It shows how even the most brilliant minds, those who seem driven by good intentions, can be seduced by ambition and power.
It's a cautionary tale. But it's also a reminder that we're all capable of making those kinds of mistakes, of being tempted by the wrong path. The important thing is to be aware of those moments, to confront our own darkness and make a different choice.
Speaking of choices, it's interesting to think about the choices audiences made back when this film was released. Remember, it wasn't a box office success. It seems like it wasn't quite what people were expecting from a horror film.
Yeah, it's not your typical horror flick. It's more of a slow burn, a psychological thriller that's more about exploring complex themes than delivering those jump scares.
Exactly. It's not about the immediate thrill. It's about the lingering unease, the questions that stay with you after the credits roll. And that's probably why it's developed such a strong cult following over time.
It's a film that appeals to people who want something more than just surface-level horror. They want something to chew on, something that will challenge them intellectually and emotionally.
It's horror for the thinking person.
Exactly. And that's why I think it stood the test of time. The Doctor and the Devils taps into our fears and anxieties, our fascination with the dark side of humanity, and the ethical dilemmas that come with progress. Those themes are as relevant today as they were back then.
Absolutely. It's a timeless film dressed up in a historical setting. It's about those core human struggles. Ambition, morality, the pursuit of knowledge, the allure of power, those things have always been with us.
They're the things that make us who we are. They drive us to achieve great things, but they can also lead us down some very dark paths.
And The Doctor and the Devils doesn't shy away from exploring those dark paths. It's a film that forces us to look inward, to confront the potential for both good and evil that exists within us all.
It's a powerful film, and one that I think everyone should see. But, for a film that's so rooted in real-life events, in history, there's also a sense of timelessness about it.
I agree. The setting might be the 19th century, but the themes, they're universal. Ambition, morality, the desire for knowledge, the temptations of power, those are things that have always been a part of the human experience.
It's a film that transcends its historical context. It speaks to something deeper within us, something that connects us all across time and cultures.
And that's what makes it so enduring, so compelling. The Doctor and the Devils forces us to confront not just the darkness of the past, but also the darkness that exists within ourselves, within our own society. It challenges us to be better, to make more ethical choices, to strive for a world where these kinds of horrors remain firmly in the realm of fiction.
And that's a powerful message. But, despite all the darkness and moral complexity, The Doctor and the Devils also has moments of humor, which might seem surprising given the subject matter.
You're right. The humor is subtle, often dark, but it's there, and I think it actually serves several purposes.
I'm curious to hear your take on that. Why do you think the humor works in this film?
Well, for one thing, it provides a bit of relief from the tension. The story is so grim, so intense, that those moments of humor act as a pressure valve, a way to release some of that built-up anxiety.
It gives the audience a chance to breathe, to step back from the darkness for a moment.
Exactly. But I also think the humor serves to highlight the absurdity and a hypocrisy of the whole situation.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, think about those scenes with Fallon and Broom. They're despicable characters engaging in these horrific acts, yet there's this darkly comedic element to their interactions. It's like they're playing a twisted game, completely oblivious to the gravity of their crimes.
It's like the film is pointing out the absurdity of their actions, the disconnect between their horrific deeds and their own self-awareness.
Exactly. And that disconnect, that's where the humor comes in. It makes us laugh, but it also makes us uncomfortable because it exposes the moral bankruptcy at the heart of their actions.
It's a clever way of using humor to make a serious point, to show the audience that even the most depraved individuals can be capable of a strange kind of humor.
Right. And it challenges us to think about our own perceptions of good and evil, to recognize that the line between the two is often blurred. But let's talk about one of the more thought-provoking themes in The Doctor and the Devils. The relationship between science and religion. It's a theme that runs throughout the film.
Definitely. It's that clash between the rational world of science, represented by Dr. Rock, and the spiritual realm of faith, which is also present in the film, though maybe not as explicitly.
Right. Dr. Rock is all about pushing the boundaries of knowledge, about using reason and observation to understand the world. But the film also acknowledges that there's more to life than just the material world. There's a human need for something beyond the tangible, for faith, for a connection to something greater than ourselves.
And those two worldviews, they often clash, especially in the context of 19th century Edinburgh.
Absolutely. Back then, religion still had a stronghold on society, and Dr. Rock's pursuit of scientific knowledge was seen as a threat by some. You see it in the clashes he has with the religious authorities, the public outcry over his work. And even the characters themselves wrestle with their own beliefs, their own doubts.
It's like the film is asking us to consider the limitations of both science and religion, to acknowledge that neither one has all the answers.
Exactly. It's not about choosing sides, but about recognizing the value of both perspectives. Maybe it's about finding a balance between those two seemingly opposing forces.
So instead of seeing science and religion as being at odds, the film suggests that perhaps there's a way to integrate them, to create a worldview that encompasses both the rational and the spiritual.
Yes. And that's a message that resonates even more today, when science and religion are often seen as being diametrically opposed.
The film offers a different perspective, a more nuanced view that acknowledges the complexities of human experience and the need for both reason and faith in our lives.
And I think that's a valuable message. It reminds us that the search for truth, whether it's through science or religion or our own moral compass, is a journey that requires both our heads and our hearts.
Well said. But as we wrap up our deep dive into The Doctor and the Devils, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and perspectives on this fascinating and thought-provoking film.
It's been a pleasure. And to our listeners, I encourage you to seek out The Doctor and the Devils and experience it for yourselves. It's a film that will stay with you, prompting you to think about the choices we make, the consequences of our actions, and the delicate balance between ambition and morality.
It's a reminder that the monsters we fear most may not be lurking in the shadows, but might reside within ourselves. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world of cinema.